tomorrow. So, of course, hydrate. Best way to prepare for a fast is to hydrate now. By the time 5, 6 o'clock tonight, it's already a little late in the game to get hydrated. So hopefully we'll get it done now and be ready to go. Hold on one second. Let me just get my notes. Okay, and let me, I think we are recording, not on Facebook, but we'll post it to Facebook afterwards. Let's share my screen. Here we go. Hatokea lechavero. This is the Mishnah Bava Kama, 8th chapter, 6th Mishnah. Hatokea lechavero. The person hits his friend, strikes his friend. I think it specifically boxes his friend in the ears. No tain lo sela. He has to pay him a sela. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mishum Rabbi Yosef Glili Mana. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Yosef Glili, he has to pay a mana, which is more expensive. Staro, what if he slapped him? Right, what's the payment? What's the cost of that? What's the damage incurred? No teloma time zuz. He has to give him 200 zuz. Lachar yado. If he does it at the back of his hand, if I'm not mistaken, right? So that's probably worse. No teloma arvameot zuz. Right, the back of his hand, right, with the knuckles. It's worse. So it's 400 zuz, double the cost, double the injury. Tsaram ba'azno. Something with his nose. Thankfully, we have some translation over here. He tore his ear, right? If he tore his ear, or talash basaro, he pulled out a clump of hair. Rakak v'yigia boruko. I think he spit at him, and his spit touched him, right? So the spit actually reached him. Doesn't seem like it's a damage, but it's certainly a shameful thing for it to happen. Hever talito mimenu, if he pulls off his garment, right, he pulled off his cloak from him. All these are aggressive types of activities. Para rosh ha'isha bashuk, if he pulls off the head covering of a woman in the street in public. There are actually these terrible anti-Semitic events in New York and California where criminals were pulling shaitels and things off of Orthodox women's heads. It's terrible. So we understand that there's a damage done there. No tain avamei zuz, right? That's a high degree of injury, right? Again, it's not necessarily physical injury as much as it is a crime, right? It's harassment, it's abuse, whether or not it leaves a long-term painful impact, it leaves a psychological impact. Zaklal. But the rule is, hakol l'fi kavodo. Right, there is some subjectivity in some of these things, depending on how honorable a person is, how much shame he or she will experience as a result of the harassment, as a result of the abuse. So there is some, even though there are objective measures mentioned in this Mishnah, nonetheless, in reality, there will be some subjectivity in terms of the payment due. Rabbi Akiva comes. Rabbi Akiva and says, "Afilu anim sheb'Yisrael rotem otam kilu heim b'nei choren sheyardu b'nechseihem sheheim b'nei Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov." Right? It's a beautiful. This idea of Rabbi Akiva is sort of to challenge the previous statement that more honorable people are deserving of more money for their injury compared to less honorable people. Rabbi Akiva, I'm not sure Rabbi Akiva disagrees per se, but Rabbi Akiva does say that even a poor person, right, is considered honorable because they have yichus, right? They have noble lineage. Every Jew is a descendant of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and therefore, let's put things in perspective. Everyone is deserving of honor, and when that honor is abused, everyone is deserving of compensation. Mishnah continues. There's a story of a man who uncovered the head of a woman in the shuk, right? This type of abuse. But Levei Rabbi Kiva, she went before Rabbi Kiva, v'chivto litain la arba me'ot zuz, and he required her to give that full payment of 400 zuz. Amar la Rebbe, tain li zman. So he told the guy said the perpetrator said, give me some time, right? Natan lo zman. So in fact he gave him time, I guess, to pay it back. Shmara omedat al petach hatzero v'shavar et hakad b'faneha ubo ki iser shemen. He caught her standing at the entrance to her courtyard, and he broke a jug of an iser's worth of oil in front of her. She unloosened her hair and scooped up the oil in her hand and laid her hand on her head. In other words, the perpetrator set up a scenario in which he tested the woman to see how injurious, how much of a shame, of an embarrassment did he cause her by taking the head covering off of her head. He proved it by breaking a small oil jug, and the woman quickly took her handkerchief, and used it to soak up the oil so that she wouldn't lose it, right? So he's trying to prove that she's not so careful about her head covering. It's not considered to be so shameful for her to take it off. He should not be on the hook for the 400 zuz. And Hamid Allah Adim, above Rabbi Kiva, he set up witnesses to see this whole event, and then he went back to Rabbi Kiva. So Amarlo Rebbe, Lazu Aninotin Arba Me'ot Zuz. It's a fascinating story. Parts of Baba Kama I remember hearing about or learning some of it, but this is a fascinating story. So he says, look, this woman is not so careful to have her head covered. It's not such a big embarrassment. I should not be on the hook for 400 zuz. I have witnesses that show that just for a little bit of oil, a small value, she was willing to take the handkerchief off her head. Amarlo, Amarta Klum. So Rabbi Kiva said, you've proven to me nothing, right? For two reasons, I would say. One is what Rabbi Kiva said. What Rabbi Kiva said is that everyone's B'nai Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, everyone's considered to be honorable. And the second point is, you are not allowed to injure someone. Who cares how much of a degree you could prove one way or the other, right? It doesn't, just because she's willing to do it herself doesn't mean that she wants to be victimized in this way. And so Rabbi Kiva remains firm and says, you've proven to me nothing just because she was quick to take off her handkerchief. Achova ba'atzmo, right? Let's say you damage yourself. So are you liable for any sort of payment? Even though you're not allowed to, right? It's forbidden, right? Our bodies are not ours. We're not allowed to self-inflict wounds of any kind because our bodies are on loan from the Almighty for us to use them in the way that is supportive and constructive, not in any way destructive. Destructive towards others and certainly destructive to our own person. Right? Others damage him, chayavin, they are obligated. And obviously that's going to be the case. Hakotzeitz nitiotav aval b'shena rashai pata, right? This is a similar halacha, but like if you cut down saplings, small trees, even though you're not allowed to do it, but you're not liable, you don't pay a fine. However, so there are certain actions which are objectively wrong, but if you do them to yourselves, there's no outward third-party penalty placed on you, right? You've suffered enough, kind of thing. However, if someone else does it, then obviously there's a penalty that has to be paid. Here we go. This is interesting as we round the corner from Av to Elul and think about forgiveness. How does forgiveness take place? So here we go. This is a very interesting mission. Av abishu notein lo. Even if right, so I victimized someone, I was liable for a payment. I paid that person. Now that I paid him, we're good, right? We're good. You forgive me? No, he's not forgiven. Right? I will not be forgiven until I specifically ask for forgiveness. Just paying my due is not sufficient. Does not suffice, right? I have to pay because I have to pay, but I'm not forgiven until I ask for that forgiveness. Shnamar v'atah hashev eshet, right? There has to be based on a pasuk. Right? There has to be based on a pasuk by Avram and Avimelech. Uinayin shelo yehei amochel achzari, and on the flip side, right? This is all good stuff. How do we know that if I ask for forgiveness from the victim, that they should not be cruel to be slow to accept my forgiveness? Right, the story of Avimelech, it was not enough. Avimelech took Sarah. God tells Avimelech that that's Avram's wife, and so Avimelech has to give Sarah back, obviously, and to apologize, and in the interim he was being punished, right? If you recall, in Bereshit chapter 20, and Avram, after being asked for forgiveness or being apologized to, does not withhold that forgiveness, but prays for the healing of Avimelech and his household. Ha'omer, if somebody says, right, so it's not enough just, right, you don't make up for it just for paying what is owed. Paying what's owed is sort of the penalty, but you got to do the essential healing or reconciliation, which is asking for forgiveness. And when a person asks you for forgiveness, you should not be slow to, you should not withhold that forgiveness. You should allow it to occur. Next in this Mishnah, Homer Sameh Eini. The person says, blind me in an eye, right? Is that what's going on here? Or Ketat Yadi, cut my hand or cut off my hand. Shvarat Ragli, break my leg, right? So if you do it, Chayav. Right? If you do it, you're still liable, right? Just because he said, punch me, you're not allowed to punch him, right? And it's not really up to the person to say, break my leg, cut off my hand. Because it's God lends us our bodies. So it's not up to you to tell me that I can harm it. Amanat liftor, but if he specifically says on condition that you will be exempt, still, chayav, he's going to be liable. You can't do something injurious to someone even if they give you permission to do so, if it's really injurious. Kara et kraksus ti, cut my garment. Shvort kadi, break my jug. Chayav, amanat liftor. But I'm right, so he's chayav. You can't, just because he tells you to do it, you're still going to be liable if you do it. But if he says, "I will not lift Torah," on condition that you are exempt from any payment, then that indeed is pater, right? So if we wanted to sort of give the parallel, my clothing, if I own it, is mine. If I tell you to rip it and you rip it, you're going to be liable. If I tell you to rip it and you won't be liable, since I own it, I'm allowed to do so. And you will not be liable for the damage incurred because I specifically told you that it's okay. Contrast that to a human being. A human being says, cut me or injure me, I'm going to be liable. Even if he says, if you do it, you're not going to be liable, I'm still liable because who owns the person's body? Hashem, and he has not given us permission to in any way damage or injure it. Very interesting, the statement of Rabbi Akiva, that whole story, fascinating story, and ending off with this discussion about forgiveness. Under what circumstances do we listen to a person to say that he waives his liability, he waives any claim he might have for injury, and in which cases do we say it's not his to waive? It's not his to waive. Okay, that therein concludes the 8th chapter of Bava Kama. I think we're rounding into the last chapter, if I'm not mistaken. No, 2 more chapters, 9 and 10. We are 4/5 of the way through Bava Kama. We'll continue. Just by the way, tomorrow we will not be meeting we will not be meeting via Zoom. We will not be meeting via Zoom. We will, there is 9:30 on yh.org/live. We'll be having live keynote. Also tomorrow morning, those who can't join us live, there will be an email that goes out and it'll be posted on the website for asynchronous, a recording of some of my thoughts on Keynote. So that'll be made available tomorrow morning for anyone that is getting up early, starting their day early, going to the 7:30 or 8:30, 6:30 or 7:30 minyan in the morning. So you'll have an opportunity. There's lots of online material, but you'll have a piece from me from the shul. I wanted to talk about today the topic of the special prayer that we say in Mincha time. We mentioned it yesterday, Nachem, the prayer that we ask Hashem to offer consolation over the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. We only recite that prayer at Mincha on Tisha B'Av, right? So tomorrow afternoon at Mincha time, in the Amida for Mincha, we recite Nachem. We say it in the bracha of V'li Yerushalayim. So I wanted to talk about the origins of that prayer, and also the question of, can we recite it in its traditional form in the aftermath of the founding of the modern state of Israel and the reunification of Jerusalem, where Har HaBayit is Biyadenu? Can we really talk about Jerusalem as being forlorn and destroyed and no one to seek it after it? I was just in Yerushalayim in February, right before this whole Corona thing, President's Week. I was there. It was a wonderful trip, and I spent. I stayed in Talpiot, and every day I would take the bus from Talpiot to some other. I spent my whole trip in Yerushalayim, learning about all the different buses that go from Talpiot and where they go. So one day I went to Givat Shaul to visit the Pua Institute. One day I went to TVA, which is where Eretz Chemda Institute is in Katamon. A number of days I went to the Old City. I met people in the center of town. So I took a lot of buses, and I can tell you that Yerushalayim was bustling. I know that's not the case now because of COVID, but it was hopping. It was hopping. As you know, for a number of years now, Rehov Yafo is closed to traffic. It's only for the light rail, and there are cafes and restaurants and musicians and all types of things going on. Of course, you have the Ben Yehuda pedestrian mall, the Midrachov, and then further back you have up Jaffa, away from the old city. You have Machane Yehuda, and then the central bus station, and then the entrance to the city and the Cords Bridge. Then you go up the hill to Givat Shaul or Har Nof. Right? It's bustling. It is happening. So does that jibe with the description of the city of Jerusalem in the Nachem prayer? So a little bit of background. The origins of Nachem, the Yerushalmi in Brachot, chapter 4, tells us that there's a special prayer to say on Tisha B'Av that seeks compassion, seeks consolation on the day, and again after Chatzot, right? Referred to yesterday's shir for a little bit about that. There, the paragraph begins with the word Rachem, which is the same word we use in benching leading up to Bonei Yerushalayim. So it's not so surprising. Rachem means have compassion. Nachem means console. There's obviously, it requires compassion to offer comfort. There's slight changes over the years in terms of where it was said. Do you say it in the bracha of Yerushalayim? Do you say it later on in Ritzei? Do you say it even later on in V'al Kulam? In the Gaonim's time, there was actually we begin to have, as opposed to up until then, it was included in, let's say, the bracha of Bonei Yerushalayim. Nowadays, there's a unique conclusion to the bracha, Chatimata bracha, Menachem Tzion Uvonei Yerushalayim, this idea of connecting comfort over the destruction with the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So there were slight differences that emerged, but by and large, it was the same. And the question, therefore, becomes, is it accurate post-1967 especially? So there are a couple of approaches. Rav Goren, the chief rabbi of the IDF, and then he became chief rabbi of Israel, reverts back to the Yerushalmi's version of the text, doesn't talk about the people in Jerusalem. It just talks about Yerushalayim absent the Beit HaMikdash, right? Because there's a question. Let me see if I can. Here we go. Let me just give you a little bit. I wish I put it on the screen share, but we can do it this way as well. Right, what do we have in this bracha? We say, console the mourners of Zion and the mourners of Jerusalem, the city that is mournful, ruined, scorned, and desolate, mournful without her children, ruined without her inhabitants, scorned without her glory, desolate without any dwellers. Right, so there's this idea that Jerusalem's empty, and that in addition to it not having the Beit HaMikdash, it has no Jews in it. Well, that wasn't really true. That's certainly not true today. And so how do you deal with that cognitive dissonance between what this text has versus what our experience is if you go down Rehov Yafo? So Rav Goren made some serious emendations based on a more traditional, authentic, earlier version of the text, leaving out the discussion about the Jews, right, the inhabitants, those who dwell there, and focusing on Jerusalem. Because it's true, even after 1967, we are missing the Beit HaMikdash. Rav Chaim David HaLevi, who was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv around the same time, didn't leave anything out, right? Didn't drastically change Nachem. Rav Goren drastically changed it from what we have, let's say, in the Siddur today. This is the Art Scroll Complete Tisha B'Av service, right? Rav Goren made significant changes, albeit he would say that they were more traditional, but they were a divergence from what had been said for thousands of years already, or at least 1,000 years since the Gaonim. Rav Chaim David HaLevi made one change, right? He added the one word shahaita, right? He would say, Nachem Hashem Elokeinu et Avelei Tzion et Tevei Yerushalayim et ha'ir shahaita avela v'achreva v'abzuya v'ashomema. Right? He added the word shahaita. It once was, right? It once was completely devoid of Jews. It once was completely destroyed. It's still lacking certain elements, certain spiritual elements, most prominently the Beit HaMikdash, but it is a nod to the fact that not everything that's mentioned in Nachem is 100% accurate and correct in today's world of Tufshin Pei of 2020. So sort of keeping the text traditional, but adding one word, shahaita, that once was all these things, at least gives a nod to the fact that the situation has changed post-1967. And then there are others like Rav Soloveitchik, who was always a conservative with a lowercase c when it comes to liturgy. Soloveitchik is very reluctant, adamantly opposed to any changes or additions to the liturgy. Not a fan of, let's say, this prayers for the state of Israel, prayers for the government, although there is a prayer for the government that goes back a few hundred years. Not a fan of necessarily of Hallel and Yom Ha'atzmaut. That was certainly Rav Soloveitchik's approach. Very, very conservative in terms of changing, adding, innovating when it comes to liturgy, even if it's using a liturgy that already existed in a new form, right? So Hallel on Yom Yerushalayim or Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut, Rav Soloveitchik was very, very reluctant. But others like Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who was the Rav Kook's son, who certainly was a messianic type of Zionist, saw that there's a famous story that Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook in 1960, like Yom Ha'atzmaut, 1966, right? Yom Ha'atzmaut or 1967, 1966, whatever it was. Maybe it was even 1967, just weeks before the Six-Day War, right? Celebrating the founding of the State of Israel. The State of Israel was already 19 years old, from 48 to 67. And Rav Tzvi Yehuda, instead of celebrating, says, "What about Yerushalayim? What about Shechem? What about Hebron?" And he was crying to his Talmidim in the yeshiva. And then 6 weeks later, the IDF gained all these locations. It's an amazing story. So Rav Kook was certainly someone who really appreciated the reunification of Jerusalem, the victories, and the expansion of the Jewish state's borders with the Six-Day War. but he too was reluctant to change it. Because as Ratzu Yehuda says, without the Beit HaMikdash, the pain endures. We are a step towards a fulfillment of the Messianic age, but we are far from there, right? It's really important. There's human beings have a tendency to be impatient. That is very true. You see it today with the Corona crisis. Certain parts of everywhere closed the same time, and different places got their peak of cases and of the virus at different times. But some places in the Northeast had it a few months ago, and by now things have calmed down. But places like Florida, the surge came months later. But we're impatient. We want it to be over with, just like it is. It's not really over, but it's much better than it is here in other parts of the world, in the country, certainly other parts of the world. So we're impatient. We don't want to wait. And that's true with the Messianic unfolding reality. We have to be patient. Yes, there's a strong Jewish presence. There's Jewish sovereignty, autonomy over the land of Israel and over Yerushalayim. But there's no Beit HaMikdash. We're not there. We're not there yet, and therefore keep the text of Nachem exactly the way it is. Rav Ovadia points out that even though the Harabai B'Yadenu, even though Israel is a Jewish state, many citizens do not appreciate Torah and mitzvot, do not live observant lives. So we're not there yet. We find that that's a major lacking. And that's something hopefully that we should try to do. There's a tremendous amount of opportunity, and there's a tremendous amount of need for outreach in Israeli society and culture. We had this past year, before everything stopped in programming, we had Sivan Rachav Meir. Her family were Mizrahi American shlichim. She was speaking across the country, and she came to our Hollywood community in December, I think it was, and she made the point that when she was growing up, she didn't know anything about religious Jews and observance, not until she met some teenagers when she was, 14 or something like that. We find that hard to believe because the rhythms of Jewish life are implanted within Israeli culture, and yet many of them, for lots of different reasons, not worth going into now, don't have a living experience of authentic Jewish observance. And that's something to be sad about, says Rav Ovadia Yosef. And therefore, we keep the text of Nachem exactly the way it is. There's still miles to go. Also, Rav Ovadia points out that our text of Nachem goes back to the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. And let's not mess with things from the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. They had the foresight to create a nusach for when there was no Beit HaMikdash. Right? Rav Ovadia has this theory that the sages knew there would be a galus and created laws for that period. Right? So Rav Ovadia has this interesting suggestion that the text of Nachem predates the destruction of the temple. Interesting idea. And therefore he says it's sacred. We should not be changing the text in any shape or form. Now again, even that theory has its challenges because we know many texts, like for instance, the third bracha of Birkat Hamazon, we attribute to Shlomo HaMelech. However, the bracha ends with Bonei Yerushalayim. Shlomo HaMelech did not say the bracha Bonei Yerushalayim. How do we know? Because in Solomon's time, Jerusalem was built. Solomon's temple was magnificent. So obviously there was a development over time that, although the theme remained the same, the exact verbiage changed over time. And some suggest maybe that's appropriate for Nachem as well. The thrust is one that goes back to earlier times. Ka'onim, even earlier, Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. But the verbiage, the specifics, maybe they require updating. But but you know, what wins the day, of course, is that even with a fully rebuilt Jerusalem, well, not fully rebuilt, I always say one of the pictures I always take when I'm in Yerushalayim is the skyline with at least a half a dozen cranes. Those huge cranes that block the skyline is meant to is tremendously invigorating. That we see Bonei Yerushalayim in real time in our lives, and it's a tremendous zchut. But really, you know, the Nachem prayer remains poignant and appropriate, even if there were those who legitimately suggest that there could be some slight changes to it, because there's no Beit HaMikdash. So what's the impact of the absence of the Beit HaMikdash? Right, so we know the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot tells us that 10 miracles occur daily in the times of the Beit HaMikdash. One of the miracles was that there was always enough room. Somebody asked, how would the Beit HaMikdash work in a social distanced environment? So I would say the miracle would be greater. That not only would there be enough room for everyone when there normally wasn't, but if you can have enough room for everyone when there's not enough space, you can have enough room socially distanced from one another, even without space. There's the beautiful idea from the Sadigar Rav that says, the Sadigar Rebbe says, why was there room for everyone? Because everyone in Yerushalayim was sameach b'chalko. They were happy with their lot. When there was a Beit HaMikdash, the people's attitudes were different. And this loss of that feeling leads to Churban. Right? Yerushalayim was destroyed. Mipnei she'amidu divrei al din Torah. Jews demanded their rights. They stopped going above and beyond the letter of the law for others. So the absence of the Beit HaMikdash is when there's an increase in jealousy, an increase in ego, a decrease in unity. There's a sense of loss of that outward, overt relationship with Hashem. I was listening to a shir yesterday by Rav David Stav, who was chancellor of the Or Torah Institutes in Israel, as well as chief rabbi of Yerucham, I believe, some town in Israel. And he pointed out that there's a medrash that says that 3 rabbis were talking about what they miss in the absence of the Beit HaMikdash. Maybe I'll end with this because it was a beautiful idea, right? What do you miss now that there's no Beit HaMikdash? So one of the men said, there's no good hot baths now that there's no Beit HaMikdash. Another man said, you can't find nice clothing anymore. And a third man said, spouses are not as good looking as they were in the times of the Beit HaMikdash. And Stav said, what do you mean? There certainly were baths, and there certainly were clothing, and there certainly were spouses, wives that were aesthetically beautiful. So what does it mean? So what it means is that there's an attitude that's lacking with the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. When there was a Beit HaMikdash, there was an integrated lifestyle, right? There was an appreciation and understanding that everything we do is avodat Hashem. And with the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, that awareness, that realization went away. And it was no longer so obvious that everything we do, when we're working, when we're sleeping, when we're eating, when we're relaxing, when we're vacationing, everything we do is avodat Hashem. There wasn't this bifurcated existence, right? Like sometimes I'm being a Jew and sometimes I'm going on with my life. No, every way in which we go on with our lives is a fulfillment of being a Jew. And that was lost in the times of the Beit HaMikdash. That was very evident, right? A farmer would farm his field and give a percentage to the Beit HaMikdash, bring his first fruits of Bikurim. Stav pointed out, in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, there wasn't shul. You didn't go to shul, you davened wherever you were, right? And your mind was, you focused on the Beit HaMikdash, right? That's not just a prayer, that's not just a commentary on prayer. That's a commentary on the lifestyle that existed. It was a much more integrated lifestyle. There wasn't a separate religious and secular experience of the persona. Everything you did as a Jew, as part of your avodat Hashem. And that's what we're missing in the aftermath of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. That's what we pine for, really, right? We pine for a time in which all facets of our lives are viewed and respected and appreciated as part of our avodat Hashem, much harder in the absence of the Beit HaMikdash. For that we mourn, and for that it's appropriate to continue to say the Nachem prayer, and there seems to be very strong support to leave Nachem as it was because of that absence. Now, Reb Chaim David HaLevi makes a point. The city of Jerusalem is not forlorn of its inhabitants. There are many, many Jews that are there, but still, we have to balance, to be factually accurate and correct in our statements in Nachem with the overarching truth that in the absence of a Beit HaMikdash, we remain mourners, we remain incomplete. Our avodat Hashem remains more disjointed and not integrated as it should be, worthy of our mourning and worthy of our maintaining the text of Nachem this Tisha B'Av, if it in fact happens. Wishing everyone a meaningful Erev Tisha B'Av, and if Tisha B'Av is a fast day, a meaningful and easy fast. And if Tisha B'Av turns out to be a Yantif, I'll see you. We'll celebrate together on the Zoom on Friday. We'll have lots to talk about. Until then, again, no class tomorrow at noon, but we will have a brief Parsha potpourri of some Parsha ideas for Parshat V'etchanan, Shabbat Nachamu, on Friday at noon. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and an easy, meaningful fast.